The humans fired potatoes at the Void warships. Goddamn potatoes. I couldn't believe it when I saw the starchy projectiles exploding against alien hulls. I shifted in my chair. The cramped briefing room aboard the UNS Vengeance barely accommodating the bulk of Klingon and human soldiers. Commander Knox, a Klingon warrior, adorned with battle scars, stood at the front, his voice gruff as he addressed us. "The Void have been striking our colonies, leaving no survivors," Knox growled. "They appear and disappear like ghosts. The only clue is an energy signature before each attack." I glanced around the room, seeing the haunted looks in the eyes of both humans and Klingons. We had all seen the aftermath of the Void's brutality. Knox pointed to a holographic display of a remote planet. "We've tracked their energy signature here. It's their base. We're mounting a joint assault to end this threat." The room grew tense as Knox outlined the plan. We would be the first wave, establishing a foothold and holding back the Void until reinforcements arrived. It was a suicide mission. "Many of you will die," Knox said bluntly. "But if we fail, the Void will continue their rampage unchecked. The fate of both our species hangs in the balance." As the briefing ended and we prepared for battle, I couldn't shake the feeling that Knox was holding something back, a dark secret that could doom us all. But there was no turning back now. We had to stop the Void, or die trying, even if it meant using the stupidest weapon I'd ever seen, goddamned potatoes. As the mission approached, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The eerie silence of the ship's corridors only amplified his unease. He needed answers. Brian found Knox in his quarters, poring over intelligence reports. "Sir, I have concerns about this mission," Brian said, his voice tight. Knox looked up, his scarred face illuminated by the glow of the screens. "What is it, soldier?" "I feel like there's something you're not telling us. Something about the Void." Knox sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You're right. Our intelligence suggests the Void may be using a biological weapon, a virus or parasite that infects and controls its victims, turning them into mindless drones." Brian's blood ran cold. "My God, when we're walking right into it?" "We've taken precautions," Knox assured him. "All soldiers have been vaccinated against known biological agents. It's the best we can do." The words did little to ease Brian's fear as he joined the other soldiers in the dropships. The descent to the planet's surface was a blur of weapons checks and hushed prayers. As the ships broke through the clouds, Brian got his first glimpse of the Void's world. It was a lifeless wasteland, the ground scorched and barren, but dotting the landscape were strange, pulsing structures that seemed to be made of living tissue. They throbbed with an eerie, sickly light. Suddenly the ship shuddered as they came under heavy fire from Void defenses. Several ships exploded in mid-air, raining debris onto the wasteland below. Brian's ship managed to land, and the soldiers poured out, seeking cover behind rocky outcrops. The Void soldiers were a nightmarish sight. Their bodies were hideously deformed, twisted and fused with strange organic technology. They moved with inhuman speed and agility, their weapons spitting bolts of sickly light. Amidst the chaos of battle, Brian saw a group of Void soldiers dragging human and Klingon prisoners towards one of the pulsing structures. The prisoners screamed and begged, but the Void soldiers were unmoved. They forced the prisoners inside, and moments later, the screaming stopped. When the Void soldiers emerged, they were accompanied by new troops wearing the tattered remains of human and Klingon uniforms. With dawning horror, Brian realized the truth. The prisoners had been infected and turned into Void drones. The battle turned against the Alliance as Void reinforcements flooded in. Brian and a handful of survivors were forced to retreat, taking refuge in a nearby cave. They were cut off from the rest of the forces, alone in enemy territory. As they tended to their wounds, Brian heard a noise from deeper in the cave. He investigated and found a Klingon soldier, badly injured and delirious. The soldier was mumbling incoherently, his eyes glassy with pain. Brian tried to comfort him, but as he got closer, he saw a strange, pulsing growth on the soldier's neck. the same kind of growth he'd seen on the Void drones. Brian recoiled in horror as the Klingon's eyes snapped open, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The Klingon lunged at Brian, snarling and clawing with inhuman strength. Brian managed to fend him off, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the infection took hold completely. With a sinking feeling, he realized the truth. The vaccine had been useless. The Void had found a way to bypass it. Brian's hand shook as he leveled his weapon at the Klingon's head. He knew what he had to do to prevent the infection from spreading, to protect the rest of the Alliance forces. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The lingering sound of the gunshot hung in the air as Brian and the other survivors stumbled out of the cave, their eyes adjusting to the harsh light of the battlefield. The scene before them was one of utter chaos and despair. The Void forces had pushed forward, overwhelming the Alliance positions and driving the remaining human and Klingon soldiers back towards a towering cliff face. Brian and his ragtag group threw themselves into the fray, their weapons spitting fire as they fought to stem the tide of the Void advance. Through the smoke and the din of battle, Brian caught sight of Nox, his face a mask of grim determination as he rallied the troops. "Fall back to the extraction point," Nox bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The shuttles are waiting." Brian and the others fought their way towards the promised escape, dodging enemy fire and striking down Void drones as they went. But the enemy was relentless, surging forward like a black tide, always just a step behind. Suddenly, a group of Void drones broke through the line, charging towards the waiting shuttles. Brian and a handful of soldiers raced to intercept them, but they were too late. The drones reached the shuttles and began to tear into them with a savage fury, their clawed hands ripping through metal and circuitry like paper. Brian watched in numb horror as the shuttles exploded, the last hope of escape vanishing in a ball of searing flame. They were trapped now, with no way out. The remaining Alliance soldiers fell back to a rocky outcropping, determined to make their final stand. As the Void forces closed in, Brian saw Nox standing tall amidst the chaos, his weapon blazing as he shouted a battle cry in Klingon, urging his soldiers to fight to the last. Brian and the others took up the call, their voices rising in a defiant roar as they met the enemy head-on. The Void forces crashed against the Alliance lines like a tidal wave, but the soldiers held firm, fighting with a savage fury born of desperation. They knew that they were all that stood between the Void and the rest of the galaxy. As the battle raged on, Brian's attention was drawn to a strange sight. A lone human soldier, armed with nothing but a simple metal pipe, was charging towards the Void lines. The soldier was small and wiry, his face twisted with rage as he swung the pipe like a club, smashing it into the Void drones with all his might. To Brian's amazement, the pipe seemed to be having an effect. The drones that were struck by it convulsed and fell to the ground, twitching and writhing in agony. The other soldiers saw it too, and a murmur of hope ran through the ranks. They began to focus their fire on the drones that the pipe wielder had struck, and to their amazement the drones stayed down. Brian realized that the pipe must be made of some kind of material that was toxic to the Void, a weakness that the Alliance could exploit. He shouted to the other soldiers to focus their fire on the pipe wielder, to give him a chance to take out as many drones as possible. The soldier with the pipe became the rallying point for the Alliance forces, and they began to push back against the Void. Brian saw Nox fighting his way towards the pipe wielder, shouting encouragement and orders. Brian joined him, and together they carved a path through the Void lines, buying time for the pipe wielder to do his work. Suddenly the ground shook as a massive explosion rocked the battlefield. Brian was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing from the blast. He looked up to see a gigantic Void ship descending from the sky, its weapons charging up for another blast. The Alliance soldiers scattered, but there was nowhere to run. The ship had them trapped. Brian saw Nox shouting orders, trying to organize a desperate last stand. But even as he did so, Brian could see the hopelessness in Nox's eyes. They both knew that this was the end. The Void had won, and the galaxy would soon be at their mercy. Brian's eyes widened in horrified realization as he saw the pipe-wielding soldier sprinting towards the void ship, its weapons charging up for another devastating blast. He shouted at the soldier to stop, but his words were lost in the chaos of battle. The soldier paid no heed, leaping onto the ship's hull with a savage yell. The soldier began to climb, using the pipe as a makeshift grappling hook. The void ship's defenders fired at him, their shots sizzling through the air, but the soldier dodged and weaved with inhuman agility, always keeping one step ahead. Brian and the others watched in amazement as the soldier reached the ship's main gun, the pipe clenched between his teeth. With a primal roar, he swung the pipe with all his might, smashing it into the gun's control panel. Sparks flew, and the panel fizzled, the gun sputtering and then going dead. For a brief moment, the soldier let out a triumphant shout, but his victory was short-lived. A swarm of void drones clambered over him, their claws tearing at his flesh. The soldier fought back with the pipe, the metal clanging against their twisted forms. But there were too many. Brian watched in horror as the soldier disappeared beneath a writhing mass of drones, still swinging the pipe with a defiant fury. Then, for a moment, all was still. An eerie silence fell over the battlefield. Suddenly, a deafening roar split the air as the void ship exploded, the blast so powerful it knocked Brian and the other soldiers off their feet. They hit the ground hard, the breath driven from their lungs. As Brian struggled to his feet, his head ringing, he saw that the void forces had been thrown into disarray. The drones milled about aimlessly, as if they had lost their guiding intelligence. With a start, Brian realized that the soldiers' sacrifice must have destroyed the void's central control system. "Press the attack," Brian shouted to the others, his voice hoarse. "Now while they're disoriented." The soldiers surged forward, their weapons blazing, cutting down the confused drones with ruthless efficiency. As Brian fought, he caught sight of Nox standing over the body of a fallen Klingon soldier. In Nox's hand was the soldier's weapon, a long, curved blade that glowed with an eerie green light. Nox looked up, meeting Brian's gaze. "This is a Klingon bat'leth," he said, his voice grim. "A weapon of honor, wielded by warriors of legend, and now it will be the instrument of the Void's destruction." With a fierce battle cry, Nox charged into the fray, the bat'leth flashing in his hands. Brian and the others followed, their weapons spitting fire. They fought their way to the center of the Void compound, where a massive, pulsing structure loomed, seeming to be the source of the Void's power. Nox stepped forward, the bat'leth raised high. "For the Alliance," he said, his voice ringing out across the battlefield, "and for the galaxy." He brought the blade down on the structure with a mighty blow. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, a blinding light erupting from within. Brian fell to his knees, a searing pain splitting his skull. His vision swam, the world tilting around him. When he looked up, he saw that the void drones had fallen as well, their bodies dissolving into a foul-smelling sludge. The ground shook beneath his feet as the void compound began to collapse, the very air seeming to tremble. Brian staggered to his feet, his head pounding. Through the haze of pain, he saw Nox standing tall amid the chaos, the bat'leth still clenched in his hand. Nox turned to him, his face set with grim determination. "We have won a great victory here today," he said, "but the war is not over. The Void will not rest until they have conquered the galaxy, and we must be ready to face them wherever they strike next." Brian nodded, his jaw tight. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, that many more would die before the Void was finally defeated. But they had a weapon now, a simple metal pipe, wielded by a brave soldier who gave his life for the cause. And with that weapon and the courage of warriors like Nox, Brian knew they would prevail. As the surviving soldiers regrouped, preparing for extraction, Brian took a moment to reflect on the battle. He thought of the pipe-wielding soldier, whose name he never knew, and the sacrifice he made. He thought of Nox and the bat'leth that would now become a symbol of hope for the Alliance. And he thought of the long road ahead, the battles yet to come. But most of all, he thought of the simple metal pipe and the lesson it taught them all, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you least expect. As the surviving Alliance forces regrouped, preparing for extraction from the hellish battlefield, an insidious unease crept over Brian. He scanned the haggard faces of his fellow soldiers, their eyes haunted by the horrors they'd witnessed. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed strange pulsing growths on many of their necks and arms, eerily similar to the ones he'd seen on the infected Klingon soldier in the cave. Brian's head throbbed, a strange tingling sensation spreading through his limbs. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling only intensified. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. Brian whirled around to see a human soldier convulsing on the ground, his body contorting in agony. The soldier's eyes glowed with the same otherworldly light that had filled the Klingon's eyes, his skin turning a sickly, mottled grey. Instinctively, Brian reached for his weapon, but before he could draw it, a searing pain erupted in his own neck. His hand flew to the spot, feeling a pulsing, spongy growth just below his ear. He tried to cry out, but his voice emerged as a strangled, inhuman rasp. All around him, the other soldiers began to undergo the same horrific transformation. Some clawed desperately at their own flesh, trying to rid themselves of the infection, while others succumbed, their bodies twisting and deforming as the void consumed them from within. Brian's gaze locked with Nox's, the Klingon's face contorted in agony, as the bat'leth slipped from his grasp. In that moment, a terrible realization dawned on them both. The void hadn't needed to conquer them on the battlefield. They had already won, long before the fighting even began. The vaccine that was supposed to protect them had been a lie, a trick to get the infection inside their bodies, where it could fester and grow until the time was right. Now, with the void's central control system destroyed, the infection was running rampant, turning the Alliance's own soldiers against them. Brian felt his mind slipping away, his thoughts becoming fragmented and alien. He knew he should fight it, try to warn the others, but it was too late. The void was inside him now, and there was no escape. As the transformation took hold, Brian's eyes fell on the metal pipe lying discarded on the ground, the weapon that had given them so much hope, that had seemed like their salvation. But now, he realized it was just another trick, a false hope, dangled in front of them to lure them into the void's trap. The pipe was never the key to victory. It was just a distraction, a way to keep them fighting while the real battle was being waged inside their own bodies. And now, as the void consumed him from within, Brian knew that the pipe would be his only legacy, a symbol of the Alliance's folly and of the terrible price they paid for their hubris. With his last ounce of strength, Brian reached for the pipe, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal. He knew he would never wield it again, never again feel the thrill of battle or the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers. But he also knew that the pipe would endure long after he was gone, a reminder of the sacrifice he and the others had made, and of the terrible power of the void. And perhaps in some distant future, when the galaxy had all but forgotten the Alliance and its doomed struggle against the void, some other brave soul would find the pipe. They would take up the fight once more, armed with nothing but a simple metal pipe and the courage of the human spirit. As the last of his humanity slipped away, Brian clutched the pipe to his chest, and in that final moment he knew he had found the true weapon, not the pipe, but the indomitable will of the human heart that would never surrender, even in the face of the greatest darkness the galaxy had ever known. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.